Okay, so our next module, we're going to be going into some sewing machine accessories that are going to elevate our sewing, perhaps make some projects a little bit easier for ourselves, and just kind of allowing us to just briefly go through what each tool is used for, and the tools that I mostly use, and some tools I don't use at all. I just have a different technique of the way I do it. So first we want to get into the bobbin. So the bobbin is basically the part of the machine. It's for the under threading of the machine. And you can either, there's two varieties that it comes in. It comes in either the plastic or the metal bobbin. I have both that I have here. And you just want to make sure, depending on your, first, never throw away your instruction manual for your sewing machine, like ever. Even if you think you know the machine front and back, I would definitely tell you any machine that you purchase, whether it's embroidery, a serger, cover stitch, whatever it is, don't throw away the manual, because you always want to, especially when you're buying accessories and different things that may not come with it, you always want to make sure you have certain information. So fortunately for my machines, I can use either the plastic or the metal. I do find sometimes that the plastic is a little loose, and sometimes that causes the thread in the back to bunch up, where the metallic ones sit a little bit more snugly. So those are things you probably want to try out. But these are the two types of bobbin, the plastic and the metallic, and they go under for the under thread of the machine. Okay. Then you have the needle types. Initially, when I started sewing, I thought it was one needle for everything, and that was just the end of it, and don't ever change it. None of that is true. You need to change the needles pretty regularly. And you definitely need to make sure you know what needle you're using for what project, because you'll find that if you're not using the appropriate needle, then you're going to have issues with the finishing of the way a thread looks. In one way I found that out is you're going to need specific needles. Like a stretch needle is for any garments that has any sort of stretch or knit material. If not, you're going to see this terrible bunching, zigzagging, and skipping of stitches. So you definitely want to invest in jersey needles or stretch needles, and that's specifically for very stretchy jersey knit type of fabrics. And I would say just keep them in the case, that way when you're changing them out for different projects, you don't forget, or you don't get it confused as to what goes to what. So there's the stretch needle that I use. There's the universal sewing machine needles that go into most machines, and they are just general purpose, and you can use it for different kinds of things. So that is the universal needle, and it goes into most machines, and it can be used across a more broader scope of garments. I also have the metallic needle, and this is, remember what I was saying when we were talking about threads, and there was a specific needle that you needed to use when you were dealing with metallics. Well, this is the needle that I use when I'm either using this for my serger or for a regular sewing machine where I'm trying to create an embellishment. I have to use these needles when I'm dealing with that type of thread. I also have a little storage area for my sewing needles, and this just kind of allows me, as I'm changing them out, it kind of allows me to figure out what needle goes where. So what I love about this is it came from Singer, and I think it came in conjunction with some other materials, but it has one for heavy duty needles, and it usually has that purple, and ideally I believe it's used for like denim and things like that, but I find it works best for me when I'm doing harder or stiffer fabrics like Dupani, taffeta. That fabrics are just a little bit harder, and I definitely use it when I'm doing sequin, because if not, or beading, because the needles tend to break when you're using those heavier duty fabrics. So even though I believe on the packet that comes in, it tells you it's for like denim, I use it for my tougher formal fabrics. Then the ballpoint needle, which is also known as a stretch or a knit needle, I keep them all in here as well. And that's for stretchy materials. If you're ever researching like how to sew knit materials, you're going to often hear the phrase ballpoint, but it's just another name for a stretch needle. And I keep those in this compartment. Regular, it's just a regular point, that says point, a regular point needle, and this is more with the universal, and you just keep regular needles in here when you're changing them out. And sheer, just like with the pins, these are finer needles, and these are needles that you're going to use for finer fabrics, and it keeps the fabric from having these indentation marks. For example, if you stitch and you realize you were off, you made a mistake, you need to take it out. If you use the shearer needles, you don't have the same issues you would have with a universal needle where it's that indentation in there, which usually requires you to like chuck the fabric and start from scratch. So this is just some helpful things as far as needles. They have different types. There's different sizes. So you want to make sure when you're reading the sizes on the needles, these are all sizing. So these are the various sizings that come in needles. So you want to make sure that you are sewing the appropriate size as well as the appropriate needle type. Now let's get into some accessories. As you'll see here, I have some accessories here, and I also have this little container of additional accessories. Before I get to that, you always want to make sure when you're talking about being organized for your sewing, it's not just the supplies that you use, it's also how you store them. I acquired this bobbin holding case, and essentially it holds all my bobbins. If you can see, I don't want to tilt it too much and everything spills out. And I just keep, even if I stack them on top of each other, I just keep them all in this like handy little case, and it just allows me to be able to, you know, access them and also make sure that they're not all over the place. How many do I have? So I've had this for quite a while, and it's just like a handy little bobbin case that I use. I think it was just supposed to be used for like normal threads, but I ended up using it for the bobbins, and I've not gone back ever since. So when you're talking about your sewing machine accessories and your sewing accessories, I think we didn't cover, but I should note that is very important for you to have good storage space. That way you can access your things and you can keep track of it. But if you're anything like me, you will still buy things twice. You will still go to the store and be like, oh, I had several of those and I went and bought more. But it's just a better way to sort of keep track of your things. Okay, so some of the accessories and foots that we'll use on the sewing machine that I'll go through with you that I often use. Some I don't use at all because I've developed a different technique in how to use it. So I'm just going to kind of briefly walk through a couple of them and just focus on the ones that I normally use. So the walking foot is this huge white attachment that you will put on your sewing machine separately. So the reason why I have this like additional kit is because this was for an older machine I had. Once I got a newer machine, it came with a couple of additional tools, but I still keep this one because it should work with the machine that I bought now, but sometimes I have issues with the needle alignment because of when I add these sewing, these new tools to it. So it's been kind of tricky sort of navigating because this was for another machine that I don't use anymore. And the machine that I have now, sometimes the needle alignment is off, but I still keep these tools because they're very, very useful. So this is just a kit that I bought separately for an older machine that I have, and it has a different set of feet that I use for them. So what are feet? Feet are just what you clip to the lower shank of the sewing machine, and they do different things. So they're named different things because they have different functions. So the walking foot is used in conjunction when you're trying to sew across an area and you don't want the fabric to bunch up. I often would hear this being used for knit and stretch materials because they have the propensity to bunch and skip needles. So I've often heard a lot of times using the walking foot in conjunction with a stretch needle, so that way you get a nice flat, even, smooth surface, or even using a walking foot in conjunction with a twin needle. And that's just a needle that has one shank at the top and two needles connected to it. So this is just something so that the fabric goes through and walks through nice and evenly so that the threads don't skip and you don't get any skipped stitches. I don't use that method anymore because I found the newer model that I have, all I have to do is baste, and that's just a hand sewing stitch that will cover. I baste the garment and I make sure I press it and I walk it through using the stretch needle, and I don't get any skipped stitches. The next one is the zipper foot, and it looks kind of like this. And the reason why you see two lines on two little grooves on each side is because you want to be able to switch the machine to either side. So maybe you're doing a zipper on this side and you want to make sure you have more accessibility over here, or you want to switch it here. So that's just like a universal zipper foot. In the book, you'll see an invisible zipper foot, and I do invisible. I mainly do invisible zipper, so I don't spend a lot of time doing the regular basic zipper. And here I have an example of an invisible zipper. So how this works is you would open it up, and to get that invisible look, you have to actually get into the very groove. You can see that line there. When you're sewing, to get that invisible zipper look, you have to get into the very groove that you would not be able to do on a regular foot. So a regular machine foot, it's not going to get you that far in. So the zipper foot is often used to sort of like get in there. So if you look at that now, the needle would be in that groove, and then it would allow for you to sew straight across, whereas a regular foot, I'll just use this as an example. See, it's blocking. You would never be able to get in there because it's blocking that area where you would get into. So this is one kind of zipper foot. I also use this kind of zipper foot, and it's just much more narrow, and it just allows that little groove, allows for you to get more inside of there. And that's just, I mainly use invisible zippers. Then you'll just see the different kinds of zippers that are used for different kinds of projects. And again, if you pick up the book goes through in greater detail of the different kinds of things. I'm not going to get too heavily into each one of them, especially since a lot of them I don't use. For example, you have the rolled hem. And this is, if you can wing it, if you can figure out how to use this without, you know, creating too much of a mess with it, this is ideal for creating those very thin, narrow hems that you often see on evening dresses and fine dresses, those chiffon layers, those very lightweight dresses. They have a very thin hem. It's usually a rolled hem. I have a different technique that I use. There's also another one here where it's a little bit wider. I have a different technique that I use only because over time, the precision that the roll hem foot gives versus this technique that I use, I'm more comfortable. Even though it takes a bit longer, I'm less about, you know, quick fixes and more about precision, especially when you're talking about, you know, higher end sewing. It's not just about how quickly it's done, because we're talking about very fine, intricate sewing. It's about how precisely it's done. And I just have not been able to get that kind of precision using this foot. So I have a different technique that I'll go into when we cover that. And the rest of the shanks, they're just used for, foots rather, are just used for different kinds of projects you're trying to achieve. And you'll see you have the blind hem. I also have a hand stitch for that. Embroidery, I like to do a lot of hand embroidery. The over edge or the overlock foot, I use a serger for that. The ribbon foot, again, I use hemming for that. Gathering, I do by hand. So a lot of these I do by hand, but if you can navigate and you can master how to use these, then it'll definitely be beneficial to you and to make your sewing a bit faster. Like I said, I'm more about precision, so I don't have any issue with doing a lot of these by hand. Lastly, I just wanted to cover the button. You can do a hand-bound button, and those are actually very beautiful. But if you didn't want to spend too much time on it, the button foot is also a great way to sort of like achieve a button. You attach it here, and you would have a mode on your sewing machine, which would basically do the work for you. And what's another great tool is that you can place the button inside of this little area, which is not moving, but you normally will place the button inside that area, and that would dictate how wide this was going to be. So if it was, as you can see, this is a very small area, so it's going to be a very small buttonhole. But the wider this is, the machine will sort of be like, oh, okay, there it is. So this will dictate the width of the actual stitch to make sure that your button size and the buttonhole that you get matches up nicely. And then obviously you would use your buttonhole cutter to create that actual hole. So if you were wondering about the buttons, this is the machine that it looks like a really crazy thing, but once you really understand, is this essentially, this is where you put the button, this is where you snap it to your machine, and this just tells you how large the buttonhole is going to be. So that pretty much covers as far as our sewing machine accessories and how we use them and some of the main ones that I use. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.